to start sharing screen. And I think actually Bastian will start kicking off our presentation. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Lisanna, and thank you everyone for having us here and for the opportunity to present the new EMBL Open Science Policy. So we are, Victoria and I, both working in the EMBL Office for Scientific Information Management, which is also pretty new. And we're basically here to support EMBL staff for every question around the open science policy and related topics. So Victoria, if you could switch the slide. So why are we talking about open science in the first place? As you know, the current science system has lots of problems, crises, for example, reproducibility or replication crisis. There's something called an affordability crisis, a serials crisis, which is basically a topic since the 90s at least, where with rising subscription costs for scientific journals, there's in general a functionality crisis that or problems with functionalities, so that research data software is not in the same way accessible or reusable or possible to be published like text, which is or the articles, which is has a longer tradition. In general, many workflows lack transparency, and one of these things is, for example, how is research assessed and what type of metrics do we use, and how do these metrics, or how are those metrics generated? So that's one case where, yeah, also it's not clear how this is always generated from the different players in the field, and one also, especially in the last years, more and more obvious problem is that there's a huge problem between the or in the communication between science and society, and all of these problems in one or the other way are tackled or should be tackled or can be tackled by the term open science. And this is a more like an umbrella term, a general set of mind that how do we want to do as a science, and how do we want to or what different types of output, or how do we want to present our output to everyone. And this should not be confused with terms like open access or fair, the FAIR principles, which are in some sense closely related to open science, but not the same. So open access, for example, is a topic which is much longer in some fields, for basically since the early 90s, but definitely for the last 20 years of a topic that's everywhere. Why? But it's just one aspect of open science. It's open science is also about open data, open source, but even further than that, open peer review, open methodologies, and these kind of things. While the FAIR principles, FAIR means findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, have been first introduced for machine readable data, but are now also for human readable data and also beyond data. But fair data doesn't necessarily have to be open, because of course the data can be, if you have a medical data, patient data, you cannot make it open, but you can still make it fair. So that's there's a broad overlap of this, but it's not the same. Next slide, please. So, and since this year, EMBL has, or since end of last year, EMBL has the new open science policy that you probably are all aware of. And the idea is, or EMBL as an organization wants to support the general open research within EMBL, but also in the broader community, and wants to maximize the openness of its research, but also of the services, of developments, and these kind of things. The policy itself focuses on mainly on three research output types, namely articles, data, and software. And the general spirit is that it's in a sense of progress over compliance. So there are very few hard requirements, and most of it is meant to lead in the right direction and to have people act in the spirit of the policy, to to act in a transparent, open, and fair way, to fill these this policy a bit more with life. There are supporting guidelines that are beyond the general the just legal document of the policy. And the idea is that this policy should be in line with the funded policies, and that basically when you comply with the funded policy, you also comply with if you comply with the EMBL policy, you also comply with the funded policies. Next slide, please. And as mentioned in the beginning, this new Office for Scientific Information Management is there to support EMBL staff to comply with this policy, or to do open science as good as possible. And it consists of the EMBL library, the archive and records management, and the open science support staff, where Victoria is one of those. And whenever it comes to any questions about the open science policy or any open science related topic, the OSIM is there to be contacted under this email, or we are also in the intranet. And now I think Victoria can present, show you a bit more in detail what the policy is about.
Thanks, Bastian. So as Bastian had already mentioned, that there are the three main aspects to the open science policy that is active as of January 1st. So the first one is publications, of course. And the bottom line for publications is that within 6 months of publication, that the accepted version should be deposited in our institutional repository, which is your PubMed Central. And in that case, that will allow the access to your full accepted article. And these publications should be published under the least restrictive license as possible, such as CC BY. And this enables the reusability of your work. And this is very important. And so all of the publications also initially should be made available as preprints. And this has many benefits. For example, having your work being recognized earlier as productivity prior to the full peer review of your work, getting more early exposure to your work, as well as having early feedback. So for all the publications now, we have a central article processing charge budget for open access fees. So please get in touch with us if you have more questions about this. I'm sure we will be in contact when it comes to processing the open access fees. Of course, we will hope that everyone gets in touch earlier and we can provide additional advice on publishing open access. So one last thing that is very important, that is a big goal of this year, is to make sure that everybody starts using ORCID as a way to link themselves as a persistent identifier as a researcher. This allows you to maintain your public record of publications as well as your affiliations. This is very important also to help you showcase your research output. So today's workshop, or today's introduction to workflows, very much seamlessly integrates the other two main aspects of the open science policy, which is data and software. So when it comes to data, so EMBL requires that all projects have a data management plan. So there's a team for data management, and we have some links in the slide for a template checklist and the application that is supported by EMBL. But the minimum requirement within the policy is that all data behind the research article should be public as well as fair. So fair principles, as Bastian mentioned earlier, is that it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. I'm sure Georg will also follow up with more details about this. But some of the simple practices that can help you in following the fair principles is using trusted community databases, publishing your data, metadata, using good standards, using digital object identifiers, as well as extension numbers to help identify and allow your data to be accessible. And of course, using standard formats and good documentation, and also an open license allows a reusability of your work. So all of this can also be supported by the data scientists of each unit. And I think there will be also data scientist experts for each unit that can support you with this. And so the next part is more about the software. So the policy asks that there is open source license that is used for software in 4 different categories. So one is what is needed to reproduce the analysis of a research article. And 2 is the software that is used that underlie EMBL services, and tools and methods, that's the 3rd one, and of course, teaching materials. So all of these are in the goals of increasing scientific reproducibility, transparency, and reusability. And so today, I think this introduction to workflows is very important, because it is important to have everybody start early on the right path, because this is definitely a lot of work. For those who have expertise and knowledge in how to employ early tools at the beginning of project, they can share with us their tools and advice. So this is also very much important for the training of younger researchers, for pre-docs as well as postdocs. And this is a place where we can have a lot of peer training and learning. Like I mentioned, some disciplines also probably have adopted open practices earlier than others, so we don't need to reinvent new wheels to do the same thing. And one challenge that we acknowledge also at OSIM is that publishing data or publishing a workflow or software can sometimes be even more work than publishing publication. So it's important that we support each other and provide and share resources. So I think it's in all of us within the community to recognize the importance and the value of published data as well as published software. And yeah, so I think there's also a lot of cultural change within the computational data science field for biology as well. So nowadays, sometimes it's hard to publish an article without having a support package alongside with it. And that also takes a lot of work, for example, like having a maintainer, and that's a longer commitment than just the publication alone. So I think this community is so great for sharing resources. And as OSIM, we're also here to learn from you. So please get in touch with us at this email to continue this conversation and share any tools and tips with us as well. And with that, I pass it on to Georg.
Thank you, Bastian. Thank you, Victoria. Before passing on to Georg, is there anyone that has an urgent question, or otherwise we can just wait together until the ending discussion? Okay, yeah, Jean-Karim.
So sorry for missing the first few minutes. I was double booked. So the policy at the moment is full of should, but my understanding is that those would gradually be converted into must. Is there some idea of the timeline here in the progression on the requirements. So for example, my understanding was people were required to have data management plan from this month, but that hasn't happened yet, at least in my unit, as far as I can tell. So I was just wondering where when the should will be converted into must.
I think that in principle, it's already a must. It's just that especially in the beginning, I mean, many projects are still old projects. So of course, there were no data management plans, but in principle, that is one of the hard requirements, that every new project starting now should have a data management plan. Yeah, or now I again said should. Must have a data management plan in that sense, yeah. But I think there is no timeline for how the policy will change. There is still the Open Science Working Group that will update and talk about what needs to change, but that requires some first experience on what parts work well, what parts don't work well in the reality. So I think that's a thing that will evolve stepwise. So also taking into account the feedback from how does it work in reality. So.
Thank you, Bastian. Any other question? Okay. If not, I think I can leave the stage to Georg then.
Yeah, thanks. I maybe sort of interpreted the title a bit more narrow than it was on Lisanna's slide. So I thought I will just form a bridge here between the kind of the general principles of open science, as they are also partially implemented in AMBU's policy, and what that has to do with workflow management systems. And as a means of introduction, oops, my slides don't advance good. I just wanted to start with, I don't know, I mean, at least for me, this was, I knew this concept longer than I had a clear idea of what open science would all entail. But in fact, there's, that they are quite related. I mean, the idea is really that, as you all know, that source code is publicly available and can freely be copied, modified, or redistributed without any money changing hands, essentially. But of course, this has been influential. I mean, it has, for example, inspired the Creative Commons licenses that were just appearing on some of the previous slides. And I'm not sure if it's really that Swiss Army knife, but I think it's been a concept that has also influenced and maybe also re-instigated the push for open science in the last 20 years, really, even though open science is probably an older concept than open source software. Yeah, and open source is a very important pillar of open science in the sense that we did, especially the data-rich disciplines, bioinformatics, molecular biology, and so on, they heavily rely on open science. And there is, of course, a lot of shared principles. I mean, both are built on transparency, so that can always have really transparent methodology and results. There is an open evaluation process in software, so you can find bugs in the Linux kernel as you can go and post peer review a paper. Open sharing is a shared principle, and both aim at open participation and collaboration, and are also geared towards open standards and open infrastructure, which we will see in the context of workflows in more detail. You see this before here. So these kind of areas that open science all engulfs, really. But the workflow management systems are especially related, at least in the strict sense, to open source and open methodology, in the sense that, you know, a workflow combines multiple analysis tasks into something like a computational pipeline or an executable protocol of your experiment, if you will. And so workflows, computational workflows have existed essentially forever. It's just a simple way of running the same analysis over and over on multiple data sets. And I guess many of you that know programming have probably written some sort of workflow in this broad definition, just by chaining tools together in Bash or in a or these kind of things. So, but what's the problem really with this? I mean, why don't we just stick to Bash? And then one important motivation that was also presented before is reproducibility crisis. I mean, you could probably fill a whole talk on the reproducibility crisis. I just cite some figures from this more or less recent article in Nature that surveyed about 1,500 scientists whether they think there is a crisis or not. And seems like most tend to think there is. And many people have already experienced problems with reproducing other people's research, but also their own. And I think I probably also belong in both categories. And if you look a little bit more closely what people state as the underlying reasons, I think many of them are culture related, right? I mean, selective reporting, pressure to publish, that's really culture related. But there is a few things that are kind of interesting where you could maybe also have technical changes that would help, and especially the fact that methods and code are not available can be changed by things like open source, and as we will see, also by open sharing of workflows and workflow management systems. So we've talked about this really sort of simple definition of workflows, but how are they different from a real workflow management system? That will be the focus of what's coming in the course. So, you know, I think some motivations might be, you know, and this is certainly, all of this is true for my own experience. So, I mean, there can be this point where you look at your Bash script and try to execute it and you realize, okay, it doesn't work immediately. And then you really, or you look at your results and you were wondering with which exact workflow configuration, with which parameters have you kind of obtained that result. And that is maybe a little bit dated. So that's exactly one of the problems why a Bash script may not be enough or ideal. And I mean, it's also true that if you try to port workflows from other people, especially in other institutes, other compute environments, it can be, it can take months to actually get it to run, and it may never actually reproduce the exact result that your colleague obtained. And so from this kind of introductory piece on workflows written by Perkel a few years back in Nature, that contains many quotes from many people, they said, you probably need a proper workflow management system when you are running the same workflow over and over again, or if you like to publish the data. And that's interesting, I think, because we just heard that sooner or later we should all be doing the later, unless this is really just something very sort of, I don't know, it's not intended for a paper. You're running a very unimportant analysis on the side, maybe that you can still do in Bash, but anything that's kind of proper and leading to a publication might require more than just a Bash script, is their conclusion. So maybe to formalize, or to have a bit more reflected picture of why you might need workflow management systems. And so the first observation is probably that, you know, even if you read the paper and the methods description of a computational analysis, you can see which software was used, and that's rarely sufficient to reproduce a computational experiment that involves multiple steps, simply because it's often not completely clear how the individual steps were combined or which parameters were used and all that kind of stuff. So that's very hard to document really in a methods part of a paper. So workflow management systems facilitate many different aspects. And one of the things is that they greatly simplify the execution. And because they take away a lot of responsibility from you to manage resources and runtime parameters. So there's really no need for you to write explicit parallelization or think about how you submit your jobs to a cluster. This can typically be taken over by the workflow management system itself. It's a great way of providing reproducibility, so it can be repeatedly executed, and also if some steps fails, or if some steps fail, then you can usually re-enter the computation at the point that makes still use of the results that were generated successfully. And especially the fact that it enables reproducibility takes away the responsibility to record everything, really how exactly you did it. This is usually done by the system itself through a mechanism that's typically called provenance tracking. So it will actually record which data and which software was used exactly. I mean, including versions and timestamps and these kind of things. So you really often workflow management systems usually come with a data management system, package management systems, dependency management. So you don't necessarily need to set that up as well. And of course, one of the things that are really cool, they make computation scalable, portable, and interoperable. I mean, you can usually prototype this on your laptop, but it's typically very easy to then run it on the cluster or even in a cloud setting. And finally, and this is an important point, especially in the context of open science, is it's very easy to share workflows because you have this level of abstraction from the execution. So it will not be very specific to your cluster setting. This is all abstracted from. So one of the things that may be puzzling when you first look at workflows as a novice is why is there so many different systems? I mean, in bioinformatics alone, there is probably more than 150 workflow management systems. And this table here from a recent paper or recent perspective in Nature Methods only lists some of the most widely used ones. And they try to give you a first idea why one may be suitable for your case and not another one, or how this may differ over the use cases. So one of the things that are interesting to consider, for example, is that there is graphical interfaces to some of these workflow management systems, whereas others are more domain-specific languages or are even more closely to programming libraries. So they really aim at different use cases and different audiences, maybe also different experience levels of their users. And typically there's a trade-off between kind of the ease of use, say by graphical user interface, and the expressiveness and feature richness, also the performance of these workflow management systems. Maybe one last observation here that's interesting is that some modern systems tend to even have yet another level of abstraction. So you tend to take the definition of the workflow as a language away from the execution framework. So you separate this. And if you look closely at this line, you see that CWL, which is a common workflow language, so it's a language description, can be combined with different execution tools. And that, for example, influences the portability or the scalability quite massively, even though the definition language here is the same. So as a programmer, you wouldn't see the difference when you implement your workflow. And so really the aim of this workshop here is to provide you with a few guiding principles, how you may select this. I mean, it's intended really as a comparative exercise to explore multiple workflow management systems and maybe give you an idea which one may work in your case best. And now to come back maybe to the beginning, what does this all have to do with open science? So one should clearly say that workflow management systems are not just invented for open science. There is actually many commercial systems developed by Spotify or by Airbnb or other companies. And these companies, of course, don't perform all their computations openly. That was never their intention. They have published a management system, but this has nothing to do with open science. But workflow management systems, they create many of the prerequisites for open science in the sense that they facilitate reproducibility, interoperability, portability, and transparency, as we've seen. It's in this context also important to note that the workflow itself can be archived and made citable with a DOI. And what's maybe the most interesting kind of recent development is there is now communities that collaborate to develop best practice workflows and thereby really try to standardize the efforts for many of the kind of fundamental recurring tasks in bioinformatics, say identify differentially abundant genes from transcriptomics experiments or things like this. And one of the most interesting of these standardization efforts centered around workflow management systems is NF-Core, in my view. So it's based around Nextflow, and it's a community that really tries to best practices for workflows in many fields, mostly now centered around genomics, but it's growing into other subfields of bioinformatics. And of course, the idea really is to minimize the redundant efforts. It's not necessary that every core facility has their own implementation of a certain workflow. And by sort of minimizing that redundancy, you can also achieve some standardization. Yeah, that's actually great. And it's quite strict in the sense that there is a lot of testing, documentation requirements are high, and you need to stick to certain implementation principles and templates. But that's all sort of means of ensuring high software quality and good maintenance. So I think it's really worth a look if you're interested in running some of those more standard tasks, I guess. And so to conclude, if you really think about workflow management systems in the context of these more open developments, I think they entail many more aspects than just open source and open methodology. So there is actually these peer review principles already implemented. You have open access and even to documentation and yeah, also kind of hackathons or conferences. You also have open educational resources in addition to the documentation. So except maybe for open data, it can address many of the problems around open science. And I hope that this will all become much clearer during the course of the workflow management systems workshop. All right, thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions if there are any.
Thank you, Georg. Let's see if there's any raised hand or question popping up in the chat. Yeah, Nicola.
If I may add something, in my experience, what I like the most about workflow management system is the case when you realize you have to change something at the beginning of the analysis, and you realize you have to re-perform everything. And on long-term projects, when you face the situation, you're so happy to have a workflow management system because you can rerun everything with one command.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I mean, there's also other things that this is really very handy. I mean, if you want to explore parameters, for example, you know, often you're not so sure in the beginning what are the ideal parameters for your workflows, and there might be very many. So, you know, typically, I mean, during the beginning, I mean, as a PhD student, I would also just set the parameters and experiment something, but this is exactly the scenario where you come back a while later and think, what the heck was the parameter setting that actually led to the best results? And these kind of things are super easy with workflows. Also, if you want to compare maybe different methods, you know, you have one step in your whole workflow that you can exchange. If you have a workflow management system, it will keep track of what was done and make the computation so much easier. Yeah, shoot.
Hey, so I think the nature of such a system is usually that probably if you're even considering using one, then most likely it is a slightly bigger project. But I was wondering if any of the existing ones actually specifically target small scale projects that are likely to be potentially at such a scale that you probably would feel that you like, oh, I don't need a workflow management system of it. Like that's too much like bulk around it because I just need to do this quick analysis.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think, I mean, we're just kicking this off here. I mean, this will hopefully become much clearer during the workshop, but this is exactly how some of the workflow management systems differ. I think, writing a snake-make workflow may not be a big overhead over a bash script. So this may perhaps be the tool you're looking for later on. Whereas if you run a core facility and everything needs to be in production mode and very much scalable, maybe you want to send some compute jobs on a bigger cluster and some even on a cloud if the cluster is busy, then maybe this may not be the use case for snake-make. But I think there is definitely these systems that have very low entry hurdles, I would say. So I think there is going to be some talking about systems that are intended for a single person use case. Yeah, I mean, just for your next analysis or paper.
I might have one question / want to highlight something. Do you trust the paper more in the scientific literature if it includes, if they mention their pipeline or they mention their workflows?
Trust is a good question. I don't know. I mean, what I definitely like is that, hey, I can try it, and it's not a big step to actually try and reproduce their results. I mean, I haven't covered anything about open data here because it would probably need another workshop to do that. But that's the other thing that, of course, is required. But I mean, it can be very nicely linked. So if you link, your workshop can link to open data via DOI. So you could probably obtain that automatically, and then you can run a whole paper analysis just with a single mouse click in the best case scenario. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely a huge added value. But I'm not sure. I mean, yeah, maybe I would trust something like this more than if it's not the case. Yeah.
Nicola.
Let me know, Georg, if you share my vision, but I consider that when you share your pipeline, also it's a bigger risk for you. Because when you do a study with dozens of analyses, everybody can make small mistakes. So on one hand, you're more likely to have to retract stuff. On the other hand, you have more security that somebody else could verify what you did.
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting thought. I mean, someone could come and find out that you made a mistake and the whole thing wasn't as great as it looked on the paper. Yeah, and I'm not sure how to solve this problem. I mean, I think at least internally in my group, I always keep saying, it's fine to make mistakes. I would rather want to find out as early as possible if you have made a mistake. And, if you communicate transparently and if things are open and we can easily look at what you did, and if it's reproducible, then we can find those errors much more quickly and they do less harm than if they persist and no one finds out on them. So I would hope, I guess, that a whole community of scientists at some point gets closer to such principles. And I think that's fundamentally my understanding. That's the idea behind open science, that it's a faulty system by default, right? I mean, science only works by, finding out other people's mistakes and rectifying them. So it's part of the process in my view.
I'm trying to do this at my scale. When a group has to publish something, I'm always asking somebody to double check what I did. And if you don't have a workflow management system, it's a nightmare to do.
Yeah, and of course, there's the nice examples in the literature that, I mean, takes years sometimes to find out some very fundamental mistakes. I don't know, I forgot the exact examples, but there's really, the literature is full of nice stories and anecdotes about this.
I mean, I would put it a little bit differently. I would say if you actually publish your workflow and you make it reproducible, and there is a mistake somewhere, people will see that it is an honest one. If you don't do that, if you're not transparent, maybe I'm special, but my devious mind would think you actually did it on purpose to publish your paper. So I think transparency beats hiding things, even if there is a mistake, because first, the mistake will be propagated if you don't actually, if you're not open about what you're doing, and that's costly for the community in general. But more importantly, it will raise suspicion that you're actually not running your research properly.
Yeah, absolutely agree. I think in my view, the biggest trade-off here is, you know, between rigor and effort, really. You know, I mean, I think it's desirable to have workflow management systems with every kind of bigger analysis. The problem is it takes a lot of effort to make stuff reproducible. And I mean, you lose something in speed maybe and in efficiency as a researcher if you do that. That I think is probably the discussion we need to have. But I think, you know, given replication crisis and these things, we really need to probably make decisions as communities what we value higher.
And also, I would say the initial investment might be the higher cost here, because once you have a system in place for properly managing your data, properly running your analysis and documenting them, then it becomes much more easy and actually less of a burden, and you gain in productivity, I think, over time, rather than actually dragging your feet all the time to meet the requirements.
Yeah, if I can say, I agree with Jean-Karim. It has been now 1.5 years. I'm using heavily Snakebake, and the more you do, the more copy-paste you do. So at the end, to create a new workflow, now actually it's not such a burden to do.
Yes, I agree.
Renato?
Yes, I wanted to ask regarding the fact that data is becoming more and more our day-to-day, and the size is constantly increasing. If having workflows, and particularly with the aspect of the reproducibility in mind, to have solutions that would be a one-click repeat kind of platform, if this is still feasible once the data is large or very large, and just your comments on that or your thoughts on that.
Well, I can comment on that. I mean, for example, I will mention that briefly in my talk, but we already have something like this with Galaxy, where you register your workflow in Workflow Hub, and then you can click on a button on the website to start the workflow on your data that you've already staged there. So I think the size of the data nowadays doesn't matter so much, because most of the time anyways it has to be staged somewhere, and so the cost is basically the time it takes to stage your data, but or maybe using object storage. At least in some disciplines, the increasing reliance on object storage makes this less relevant, I think.
So, but in some cases, we are actually talking about processing the data from the raw stage, right? And in that case, it can be quite a significant effort. Just thinking about some of the experiences that I had while doing my PhD at EMBL, we had some projects that had easily 1 year of computing time on the cluster, taking 80% of the EMBL cluster, which is not a small cluster.
Well, I mean, there are different ways of dealing with this. I mean, I think part of the problem is that our tooling is actually quite inefficient. So there are, I think, in many cases, better ways of dealing with the problem, and we are seeing this in imaging, where we're rethinking the ways we are dealing with images, because the old ways and old software are not necessarily scalable in that sense. So it's a combination of things. I think, yeah, the size of the data, I think, in my view, is now less relevant than its complexity, that is, in terms of the things that is inside. I mean, we routinely now deal with terabytes of images in one data set, and that's not, I don't think it's much more of a problem, as long as you have, of course, the computing resources or access to computing resources for dealing with it.
Of course, if you have a project of that scale, you might, consider some workflow management systems sort of prior to others. I mean, yeah, maybe you really want to control the behavior of the workflow management so that it doesn't create a ton of intermediate files via I/O file systems and these kind of things. But this largely depends on your choice and your configuration of the management system.
Thanks. And a slightly different question. So I have this understanding or this vision that a workflow in itself is an answer, or could be an answer to a question. So from a point of view of experimental design, the workflow as it is submitted is trying to answer a specific question that was asked. So under this understanding, how much are we compromising the reusability of some of the workflows, or how tied to specific questions are the workflows, and are there any approaches that we could use to maybe increase reusability in that sense?
Good, that's a good question. I mean, I think one direction that addresses this is kind of modularity within workflows, is my understanding. So if you have individual modules that can be, again, tied together to larger workflows, and that seems to be the case for some of these NF core pipelines, I think that may facilitate the reuse even of individual components of such a workflow. And I guess when coupled with community development efforts is maybe even more powerful, because you have already sort of best practice components that when you reuse, they should at least avoid some of the most stupid mistakes.
But won't in that case we be going a little bit more in the direction of, so for instance, in the past we often had a software to perform a certain task, and one could think of one specific software as one module in a workflow. Won't this be going a little bit in the same direction, that the workflows end up being just a little bit of glue between different kinds of software?
So maybe if I may, I think we should probably get to these questions after my talk, because I think we also need now, I feel we may not have all the elements for the discussion that I wanted to introduce in terms of what do we actually consider workflow and what the workflow management systems do and this type of things, which may provide elements of answers to some of those more technically oriented questions.
Thanks.
So I don't know if we are having a break or.
So it was scheduled. I would say we can have a very short break, like 5 minutes, just a bio break, if you're okay with that. Okay. So we will meet at 58, something like that. Would that work?
Yeah. Or could just say 3 o'clock.
Yeah, let's say 3 o'clock at the hour. Okay. Yeah. So see you soon, and thank you again.
It's time for a coffee, quick coffee.
the recording here. And then leave the stage back to Jean-Karim.
Okay, I will share my screen. Okay, is it showing up all right?
Oh, good.
There was a short delay on my side. Okay, so as a bridge, let's say, between the open science discussion and the workshop in a couple of weeks, I wanted to basically take a little bit of a step back and look into a little bit more details about what we mean when we talk about workflows and workflow management systems. And Georg basically answered already the questions of why use a workflow management system, but I want to go a little bit more into some of the underlying concepts or structures to basically make you or help you make a more informed choice of workflow management system. So I want to talk about what workflows are, and in particular, precise the meaning that we talk about scientific computational workflows and not, for example, business workflows, which are different things, and what the workflow management systems are, and in particular what they do. Although Georg alluded to a little bit to some of this, and how they can make your computational workflow fair and follow some of the open science principles. So what is a workflow? I mean, there are a number of definitions used out there. One approach sees them as a set of tasks with some relationships, typically dependencies between them. Then some other view them as a formal way of describing data handling and processing. And of course, they are not completely mutually exclusive, but they can help us guide our thought about workflows. One thing that they have in common is basically this concept of being independent from input data. And that's been mentioned already several times, that you should be able to run the same workflow using different data as input. And that's basically the key to this reproducibility aspect, where you take the same data, you run the same workflow, you get the same output, but you can take different data and run exactly the same analysis on a different input. We heard a lot about workflows in the context of bioinformatics, but they are actually not limited to bioinformatics. And in fact, almost everybody who's doing computational work is having workflows. So here I'm taking an example from the bioimaging field where we want to do some image analysis. So we have some images that are from cell nuclei labeled with some fluorescent marker, and we want to characterize those nuclei by computing some numerical descriptors for them, such as shape, average intensity, texture, which basically all this we call feature. And so our images may not be where the computation is going to happen. Maybe it's in a remote repository like the bioimage archive or the image data resource, or maybe it's still on the microscope, on the storage associated with the microscope. So we need to stage these images. And once we have our images, we need to read one image. Maybe we need to tinker a little bit with it, pre-process it to remove some noise, for example, do some background correction. Finally, we need to identify the nuclei. This is the process of segmentation. And once we have our nuclei, we can, for each of them, we can compute features, so calculate its size, its average intensity, and so on. And at the end, we may want to save our results, maybe in a database or maybe in a table, and big spreadsheet, for example. So how do we go about this? I mean, usually the first step is manual. So we explore the data using some graphical interface-based software like ImageJ. So you go, you open your image, you tinker with some of the parameters, and then you export some results. So this is all good, but you can quickly see the limits when you have hundreds or thousands of images. That also doesn't scale very well. But the other problem is that if you are actually setting some of the parameters, let's say, for example, here you select a threshold for each image. If you want to make this analysis reproducible, then for each image that you've tinkered with, you need to record those parameters. And that's a bit tedious because there's no real mechanism besides you noting it down in your lab notebook for recording what you're doing here. So for this reason, and also for scalability, what you do is then you try to automate your workflow, for example, by writing a script. Typically, if you want to chain multiple tools, as Georg mentioned before, you can use bash scripts, but you can also write things in different scripting languages, which basically a lot of people do. So I'm showing you here the example written in the R programming language, but you don't have, I mean, you can use anything. And it's good, but there are also still things that not perfect, and then we'll see a little bit why. So what does what makes up our workflow? So what we have here, we have some tasks that have, for example, numbered here 1 to 6, and they have dependencies. So typically you can't do feature extraction if you haven't done segmentation, because you need to know on which object you're going to extract some descriptors. And so input from one task can be the input of another. And here, for example, the input to the feature extraction involves the output of the segmentation, but also the original image. So you have 2 inputs to one task coming from different parts of the pipeline. In the example I've taken, it's obvious that you can run tasks in parallel because you don't have dependencies on between the images. So each image could be processed on its own. So if you have 100 images and you have 100 processors, you could just run things all in one go. And so if it takes 1 minute to process one image, 100 minutes shouldn't take much more than 1 and a few seconds, 1 minute and a few seconds. So, but then for this, you need to have the computational resources to run those tasks. And these tasks have metadata. So we've already mentioned the input data, the parameters, for example, what was the threshold that you selected for each image, but also each task run as a job, as timestamps, some exit status, some information, potentially information about the resources it used. And finally, you need to do some data management. So each task needs to know which input it can take, so where to find this input, and also send the outputs to the right place. So to execute the workflow, we need to sort those dependencies first. So, but that brings the problem of dealing with failure. What happens when your job crashes in the middle of your workflow? And typically when it's a script, if you don't do anything particular, then you will have to rerun everything from the beginning, or you have to implement yourself some logic to handle the case that fails. You also have to do the resource allocation yourself. So if you want to move from your laptop to a compute cluster, maybe your laptop has 8 cores, and so you can run 8 tasks in parallel, but then on the cluster, you have access to a lot more. So you need to split the data differently when you're on the laptop than when you're on a cluster. And with the script, then you have to also deal with this yourself, basically. And also when you want to execute in different environments, you might want to care about ensuring that all the requirements are present, that your software can run in that environment, and so on. And as Georg mentioned, we want to keep track of metadata and provenance, so that we want to know what went into which part of the workflow, which tasks has processed what and produced what. This is important from an open science point of view. So we want to know the versions, the parameters, the inputs, outputs, all this kind of information needs to be documented. And again, if you go back to the example where you run your workflow manually with a graphical user interface, this can be very tedious to capture for all the images you're processing. So a workflow management system is basically a software that helps with all these tasks and basically some of them help you create the workflow, for example, with a graphical user interface, but they actually help with running in multiple environments, as mentioned before. They should be seamlessly transferred from your laptop to a workstation to a cloud, at least for the more modern systems. And they automate many of the tasks that I've mentioned before. And the nice bit about those things is that they work with existing code or software. So it's not like your script where you might need to change it depending on where you want to run it. Here, you basically specify the software, and some of the tasks, like dealing with the splitting of the data, will be taken care of automatically based on available resources. So a quick round of around the things that a workflow management system would do, and most likely your scripts won't, is some data management tasks, running or tracking provenance and metadata, monitoring your jobs or running them and monitoring them, and particularly also implementing checkpointing, that is taking snapshots at different stages of progression, so that when a job fails, for example, you can restart just that job from where it failed, or restart the pipeline from the last known good snapshot. You can have logs of what's going on, and some of them also produce nice reports in various formats with some graphics also. The workflow management system can handle the job scheduling, parallelization, by provisioning the resources, and they do this usually with interaction with some underlying workflow management system, workflow managers, such as Slurm, for example, in our cluster. And the modern ones, they also have deploying software on demand. So by basically incorporating some package management systems. So there's been already mentioned of Conda, but also containers. And so that when the workflow management systems encounters that a software with a specific version, it's going to look at its package managers and find it for you and deploy it for you in the environment that you're running it. And that's also an element that provides portability. The ideal goal is to run anywhere. Of course, that depends a little bit on the specific management system that you're using. older ones tend to be a little bit more constrained, or if they haven't been modernized, I would say, for example, things running in the cloud are a bit less common than things running in an HPC. And so to understand a little bit about what workflow management systems do, I think we need to look at some of the elements that compose them or that makes them work. So first, you need to have a language to describe your workflows. And then to execute a workflow, you need a model of computations that the runtimes, that is the actual software that implements the workflow management system, can use to basically map the description of the workflow to this model of computation and come up with an execution plan. So the workflows are described using domain-specific languages. So that is languages that are made for specifying workflows. Some of them, most recent, are basically extension of scripting languages or very similar to scripting languages. So here I'll give two examples. On the left is SnakeMake, and on the right is Nextflow. So you'll see them more in the workshop. But I want to point out that those languages may not or don't have to be associated with an execution engine. They can be used purely for description purposes. And for example, CWL, so the common workflow language that has been mentioned before, is primarily a description language. It can be executed. Some engines actually can read it. But what we are seeing it used mostly for is some sort of common language that allows basically portability from one management language, a workflow management system to another. So that we see a lot of, at the moment, export as CWL type of functionalities in workflow management system. So I mentioned some workflow composers, or at least that some workflow management systems allow you to compose graphically your workflow. So this example is taken from the Galaxy workflow composer, and it shows like a non-bioinformatics example using the bioimaging tool called Cell Profiler, where you can compose a cell profiler image analysis pipeline in Galaxy using this graphical user interface. But the important point about workflow management system is also their model of computation. And here I basically illustrate what many of them do is that they view workflows as directed graphs, but you can actually have two views of those on those graphs. So the nodes are the tasks or the jobs, and you can have a graph where the links between the jobs are actually the status of the previous job. So for example, you could only start executing feature extraction only when the segmentation jobs has completed successfully. But you can also view the workflow as being driven by data availability. And so, for example, you could start executing the feature extraction task only when its inputs are available. So you have basically, this is called the data flow model. The other one is more like a process network type of things. And so they also have a little bit of an impact on how efficient a workflow can run given the available resources. Georg mentioned that there are a lot of workflow management systems. The review he pointed out listed 150. There are actually more than 300 workflow management systems out there. Scientific workflow management system that can be used for scientific computational workflows. And so, of course, that's hard, make it very hard to choose, but some of them are a little bit old and may not be suitable in a modern computational environment, so they could be probably eliminated. But still, what all these things do is generally to address the same kind of issues of running a combination of tasks in a scalable way. And so, as I mentioned, they can have different computational models. They also have different features, and they maybe have different approaches on the way they're going to deal with your data and your software. So some considerations for that, as already alluded to, you can look at whether there is an interface that suits you. Is it a scripting language or a graphical user interface or some sort of other way of specifying the workflow? Whether the system can manage the type of workflow you want. For example, workflow management system that can deal with loops and conditional branches are much less common than those that can deal with simple linear or bifurcating workflows. You might want to consider also the domain or the community that is around the workflow management system, so that it maybe is more used as a standard in that community or in that scientific domain, and whether it supports your different compute environments. As I mentioned already before, cloud resources are maintained or supported at different levels in different management systems. So that's something that you might want to consider. Finally, I want to mention that the ones that are in use at EMBO include Galaxy, Nextflow, and SnakeMake. Those are also the ones that are being promoted as part of the European Open Science Cloud for the life sciences, so large EU infrastructure project, if you want. And also the common workflow language is being promoted as a workflow description language, not necessarily for execution, but as I mentioned before, just a common way of describing a workflow so that it can be executed or converted into other languages for execution. In terms of open science and sharing your workflows, the EOSCLAV project has built a workflow hub, which is basically a registry of workflows. And what it does is actually look at for workflows in repositories, such as GitLab or GitHub repositories. Since workflows are basically specified using text files or like scripting, like code, so you can basically maintain or manage them in Git-based or version control systems. And what Workflow Hub is doing is that reference the workflow repository and annotate it, if you want, with the proper metadata to make it fair. And also you can make it citable there with a DOI. So once your workflow is in the Workflow Hub, you can actually mint a DOI for it. And in addition, the workflows are packaged using this new specification called arrow crates or research object crates, which allows to package the workflow, for example, with test or example data with some metadata. And that allows also the workflow to be transferred in different environments. So basically what I wanted to convey here is that the use of workflow management systems is the next step in programming. So then when you have a script and then you start reusing the script in for different data or in different environments, that's when you want to move to a workflow management system. And in the end, with every move, the earliest in the process, the better. So probably once you've gone past the experimentation or the exploratory step by working scripts, you should start using a workflow management system. And what that helps you with is also to make your work transparent, reproducible, and of course, easily shareable and reusable. And by doing this, you probably increase the impact of your work. And by using repositories and registries dedicated for workflows, you're making your computational work fair, much more so than if you just put it in Zenodo, I would say. And that's about it. If you have questions, I'm happy to take them. I think we're close to running over time.
We are, but I think we can keep discussion a little bit more. There is a question in the chat. Would you like to read it or should I?
I can. Naive, probably a very naive question, but what is the difference between a workflow and a pipeline? Is it a matter of linearity? And how is this defined in light of a workflow management system? I think that's a good question. I would say, in my experience in everyday use, it's the two are synonymous. I would say cell biologists would talk about pipeline and bioinformaticians would talk about workflows. If I were to basically caricature, I don't think I've ever come across someone who made a very precise distinction. I think they're used interchangeably, and the use of one word over the other is probably community dependent. But maybe someone has a different experience here.
Seems Charles seconds what you just said in the chat. Yeah, there are a couple of people agreeing. Oh, okay. I don't know if we have any other question. I may have one, and it's about Workflow Hub versus like having a repository in GitLab. So the real advantage, it's all about verification of the sharing, right? So it becomes by depositing in Workflow Hub, it becomes searchable and findable.
So maybe I wasn't very clear. So Workflow Hub is a registry. So your workflow stays in your repository. So the first thing to do is to create your GitLab repository for your workflow. And then you put it here. And then you go to Workflow Hub and you register it. So you tell basically Workflow Hub, here is my workflow. And you may have to provide a bit of metadata on your workflow, similar to other type of things where you need to basically track provenance and things like that. And then if you want, you can basically freeze your workflow to a particular version and associate a DOI to that particular version of your workflow. And that's all done in the Workflow Hub. But the first step would be to put, you can actually upload a workflow to Workflow Hub, but the preferred mechanism is you have your workflow in your own repository and you just point this there. What I didn't mention, what the Workflow Hub is actually also doing, and we're working on, is something called Life Monitor. So since we package the workflow in this our create object, and we have some tests and we put some test data in there, the Life Monitor will periodically rerun your workflow on the test data or on sample data and test whether it still actually works, so that if a workflow fails at some point, then it will be flagged, so that you will know basically if things still work 2 years from now, so that to avoid things becoming stale.
Thank you. I think that's really interesting. Okay, there's another question in the chat. is the workshop open to non-EMBL researcher? Yeah, no, it's not. I'm sorry for that.
Yeah, I want to say that occasionally in EOSC Live, we're running workshops on this topic. So you might want to check maybe the EOSC Live website. I know there is a hackathon happening very soon. But unfortunately, I think the deadline was yesterday or today for registration. But check on the EOSC Live website. There should be a section somewhere on those workshops. I think it's under the Fair Hackathon heading or something.
And just to clarify, the reason why it's going to be close to EMBL, it's because we're going to discuss some resources and mostly some research that is EMBL specific. But I also suggest you to look at EOSC Live resources. I think they're very valuable in this field. Okay, we are almost perfectly on time. So I thank all the speakers, and if you're interested in keeping this discussion, I invite you to register to the workshop that is going to happen from the 14th of February onwards for 3 days. And that's it. We will send the slides and recording of this workshop or make them available through the website soon. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.